How did the project come to be?
Yeah, well, I mean, at Art Jameel, we've been engaged in thinking about the climate crisis and thinking about sustainability in general for quite a few years, around 5 years. It's been quite a pillar of our programming. And then, of course, in the lead up to COP, locally in the UAE, these themes became, very acute, became, very much part of at the forefront of the agenda locally. And then also, we were thinking about how to take out what was happening locally to a kind of regional context and beyond, and to make sure that anything we did that was related to that kind of particular moment around COP was drawing in kind of a regional focus, and also had a real element of kind of legacy within it as well. So, this has been quite a long-term endeavor for us, and COP in a way is a way of kind of focusing attention and really kind of getting the whole community behind these kinds of debates. But it's not the be-all and end-all. Obviously, it's almost like a kind of global to-do list of priorities, and then out of that comes the real work before and after such a meetup, in terms of kind of how, as an arts community, as an industry, we kind of respond to this. So we were thinking about how to mark this moment in a very sort of significant way and tap back into a strand within our approach to sustainability and addressing the climate crisis, which is looking at kind of original research and kind of projects that in themselves become a kind of focal point, but are also really instrumental in taking forward R&D. So looking at research and development of new materials, new ways of thinking, new ways of kind of relating to the relationships between the human and non-human world, and kind of doing that in a way that's really kind of compelling on every single level. So we're very aware of the role the arts play, a very special and very particular role in communicating the climate crisis and drawing in very broad communities as kind of actors, as active participants in trying to address that kind of crisis, and not only kind of consumers of rhetoric from elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, it really started with, we're invited to participate in Art Jameel's sort of like climate charter that they were developing as part of their like culture and climate work. And so basically my contribution to this was really about, I mean, obviously showing the work that we do and all of that to the people that were attending the workshop, but also about this kind of reframing from this, so they're doing great things. They're developing metrics, and they're, doing audits on like greenhouse gas emissions of like their facilities, but also their, exhibitions and all of that. But for me, I kind of kept on hearing the same things as I hear from the built environments. Like, okay, we need to do, to spend, X% less energy and X% less water and all of that. And all of that is part of this mindset of scarcity. And so my kind of thing was like, how do we transform this, or how do we reframe this into thinking from a mindset of abundance? Like, there are enough resources if they're just misused or misplaced. So for example, like, what if we think of waste as a resource and as a nutrient, because that's what it is in nature. Waste does not exist in nature. It's a nutrient. One organism's waste is nutrient for another organism. So just simple ideas like that. But it's really about, we kind of need to move beyond just thinking how to do a little less bad, and really move into what are the positive changes that we can actually be doing. And with cultural institutions, I mean, they have access to, buildings and space and landscaped areas and all of that. So there is already so much that they can do within their immediate context. And so that was the starting point for me.
How does a curatorial engagement with topics of ecology and the climate crisis go hand in hand with Art Jameel's institutional commitment to the environment?
So, I mean, when we were constructing Jameel Arts Centre, we thought a lot about the kinds of ways in which we can create gardens and spaces that are very locally relevant and also kind of minimal in terms of their impact. So all the desert gardens that are around Jameel Arts Centre are themselves a kind of experimental outdoor galleries, in which plants are the stars and in which the kind of flora and fauna comes to the fore. And those galleries, whenever you're in the galleries, the actual art galleries, you're able to see out and interact with the plants in these desert gardens as well. And before we opened in 2018, we actually decided that one of those gardens would be reclaimed as an artist's garden, so a space of commissioning original research by artists around the ideas of gardens. And we're now in our 5th artist garden commission. It happens every 2 years. And I think that kind of process of working with artists and quite radical artists and thinkers in that space, so mixture of sort of ecologists and artists, about the nature of gardens and about the nature of the relationship between the institution and the environment around it, has really kind of forced us forward in our kind of thinking about this kind of relationship between art and the non-human world, between humans and non-humans, between architecture and people, and between community and space, and really trying to sort of think about how to create new kinds of spaces that really spark and encourage very radical thinking in terms of our relationship with our immediate environment. And in a way, we kind of see it in a series of concentric circles. So we have our own sites that we take care of. And over the years, the last 4 years, we've been doing carbon footprint studies every year, trying to sort of really look and analyze our own footprint and our own, the way we deal with waste, the way we deal with water and electricity, and to sort of gradually work on bringing down that carbon footprint, our own carbon footprint. So trying to walk the walk as well as talk the talk. So we think about our own micro environment where we are in Jaddaf Waterfront, and then we work out from that into the city of Dubai, the UAE, the Gulf, and into the wider region as a whole. And I think regionally, it's very important for us to sort of see, working together with colleagues across the Arab world, but also thinking about our relationship and our space and place within Asia, within the wider Asia kind of context. So we see increasingly our role as being part of West Asia and the relationship between the Gulf and South Asia, and then across to sort of East Asia, and seeing ourselves as very much part of that kind of trajectory when it comes to climate, and when it comes to interaction and back and forth and cultural links, links of tradition and the culinary and, the kind of trade relationships that are so key to defining what makes a place. And I think what we realized in that process is that so much of what we inherit in terms of how we understand the climate crisis, as well as how we understand art history, comes from a kind of quasi-colonial mindset. Sometimes it's very much sort of dictated by an idea of what the climate crisis is, as is viewed from North America and Northern Europe, just as we sort of understand sometimes that that's how institutions are built, or that's how conservation is done, and that's how collections should be cared for, and all these kinds of kind of over meta themes that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. So we're always trying to question ourselves: are we just, is this inherited wisdom rather than ground up knowledge? Are we kind of really foregrounding knowledges and ideas and traditions from Asia, and really learning from our own environment rather than adopting something from somewhere else?
How does the Tarabot Pavilion fit into the longer legacy of work Art Jameel has been doing at the intersection of art and ecology?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think this idea of addressing climate change through the arts, for us, it kind of breaks down into 3 different areas. One of which is original research, so which we just talked about just now, this kind of thinking from the ground up, thinking about how to institute new ways of thinking about how the arts and climate change kind of interact. And the second is all around the idea of kind of original programming that speaks to broad audiences, but also furthers new kinds of thinking. So, recent exhibitions I can think of that particularly look at this theme are, An Ocean in Every Drop, which was an exhibition at Jameel Arts Centre curated by Noura Razian that took place last year and involved artists, all of whom are thinking about the idea of water and oceans and how we can sort of rethink our relationship with the sort of slippery stuff that actually defines our lives. And the exhibition started with a set of 13th century manuscripts that looked at sort of maps of the world that thought about the oceans as primary. So this kind of idea that land is secondary and oceans are primary, and it's the oceans that connect the world, and there are no boundaries that can be actually, enforced as such in terms of the material when it comes to the ocean. So kind of thinking about the world as a watery world in which land comes secondary was this kind of way of almost kind of spinning the viewer's idea of how the world kind of exists and what is kind of primary in our sensory world, as well as our environmental and sort of cultural and conceptual world. And then it went through a series of works by contemporary artists, all of whom were thinking about this kind of idea from a very spiritual kind of perspective to the everyday, to areas of activism around dams and around indigenous practices, and all the way through to the ways in which mythology and faith kind of interacts with water. So it's a way of kind of, resetting our brains when it comes to oceans and water. And then another example would be an exhibition that took place at Art Jameel, our space in Saudi. It was titled Staple, What's on Your Plate? And looking at the idea of kind of politics of food and the future of agriculture and ways in which we can, again, kind of reboot that relationship. And, that included us bringing beehives into the center and caring for them over a number of months, planting gardens that the bees could live from. That was part of a project by Moza Al-Matrushi, who was looking at traditional practices of keeping bees and how bees are migratory and go, through the Kingdom of Saudi, making honey as they go and interacting, this very special sort of human non-human relationship, which is sometimes very fraught and very violent, and other times incredibly beautiful and kind of spiritual in its nature. So kind of really exploring all these kinds of ideas. Another project within that by Lin Ajlan was looking at the practice of date farming in Saudi and how to create zones of other complementary crops that could exist together with the dates, which would then sort of feed back into the soil and keep the soil alive. So again, some projects within that exhibition were purely kind of what we would normally term contemporary art, kind of works on the wall that people looked at and interacted with. Others had that function, but also acted as kind of R&D projects that actually changed the ways in which people thought about farming out of that exhibition. So this kind of relationship between exhibitions and their relationships with industry, with learning, with academia, and the ways in which these exhibitions and this thinking can actually really, force a shift in the way that the wider world or our kind of comparable industries across science and agriculture, for example. I think that role of exhibitions and the role of the arts institution as a place of ideas, of generation of change, of sort of places that generate change, can be really crucial, and something that's very important to us at Art Jameel. It's not only about passively observing pictures on a wall, or it's actually not about that. It's also about kind of drawing in audiences to become active participants in rethinking their world.
How do the materials used in the Tarabot pavilion play with the idea of regenerative architecture?
Exactly. So as you said, it's not about just being less bad, but how can we be positive, and what's the positive impact of this built structure? If it's not there, what's happening on site, and when it's there, can it actually catalyze something positive for the human and the more than human? And so the materials needed to respond to that brief as well. And also the brief was that this is a temporary pavilion that will be up for 5 months. So we didn't want to design and build something that is meant to live for 15, 20, 50 years, but that we know is going to be dismantled in 5 months. So we really wanted to make sure that we are taking these limitations into account when we are designing. So we wanted materials that could last up to a year, that would not degrade within this year time span, but that if eventually when they are taken apart, when they are reintroduced into soil, that they could actually be decomposed, reused, recycled, upcycled, or take on a second and a third life. So that was definitely part of our intention. We wanted to move away from these big fancy pavilions that are made for a COP and these other events like Expo, but that eventually end up being waste. So we're talking, we talk about sustainability and regeneration. Mostly we talk about sustainability, and then we end up with this waste product. So it's a bit like single-use plastics. I kind of used it for this one event, and then toss it away. So it was really about kind of thinking, how is this project regenerative? So for it to be regenerative, it's moving away from like, how can I be less bad, but actually what's my more than one life. And so these materials, for example, also a lot, I mean, our work is very collaborative. So, of course, we've developed these ideas over many years, but then the way we make them happen in a certain place is very collaborative with people from the local community and then the institutions that we're working with. So a lot of ideas came about also when discussing this with the Jameel Art Center. So their main issue was that they had this big open space outside that no one was using because it wasn't even kind of fit for human life. Let's say there's absolutely no shade. It's all, there's lots of concrete on the ground. There's some landscaping, but it's very manicured, exotic landscape, so it's kind of not even fit for human life, let alone for other forms of life. So it really was about, how to bring in our ideas of interspecies habitat and a generative architecture with the requirements actually and some of the challenges that the institution was facing. And so when we started looking at materials that would be there for this amount of time and that could take on a new life, one of the first materials we knew we wanted to use was mycelium. So panels made from mycelium, because they are essentially, we really wanted to work and to build with other organisms as well, not just build for other organisms or design for other organisms, like from a top-down approach. So we're like, okay, how can we also have that process done with other organisms? And so, and that's where the idea of using mycelium came about. And because they're actually building this panel out of waste material that we are feeding it. So we designed the molds, we designed, we had identified what kind of waste material was there, and then the mycelium is feeding on it to create these panels. And through that collaboration with Dima from Mycosphere, she put us onto this other material that we ended up using, which is called desert board. And so, because most of the mycelium panels she makes come from the waste from the production of this material called desert board. And desert board has a really interesting story because the company is repurposing waste from the date palm industry, which is huge in the UAE and in the region. They're repurposing this waste that would usually be burned by farmers or be sent to landfill. So it's all the waste from the date palm industry, like pruning and removing leaves and all of that, and then using them to make a highly technical architectural product that is commercially available. So they built a huge factory. They are producing this commercially. So it was very important for us to play with things that, mycelium and the work that Mycosphere is doing is still on a smaller scale. But then you have other companies that have been able to scale up and to create a very stable and performative material that could actually replace building products. So that was very important. And then the third material we used was date form, which is also coming from the waste of the date palm industry. And this is taking the date pits, that are usually wasted. There's, I don't know how many, like dozens of millions every year that get wasted, that are usually sent to a landfill. And those are then actually roasted and pressed into a very kind of beautifully finished material that actually has the scent of roasted dates. So these three materials really made a lot of sense together. And it's all about repurposing waste, cycling waste through soil, giving value back to waste as an actual product, and then working with other organisms to make this material actually happen. So this is for the part that relates to soil and waste, but then also in the water part of the pavilion.
Could you tell us more about how Solomar Miller's works in the Tarabot pavilion engage with local flora and fauna?
Yeah, well, I mean, it was interesting. I mean, early on when we've been having a series of conversations with regional partners. So about a year ago, we began this network of ecologists and arts organizations across the Arab world. And we're working together on kind of developing toolkits for how to decarbonize spaces, and also for a kind of regional charter that we'll put together on how, as arts organizations in the Arab world, we want to approach the climate crisis. And it was through those conversations with colleagues and also with international colleagues, such as Julie's Bicycle in the UK, where we really began to think about this intersection between sustainability, biodiversity, ecology, and the idea of kind of environmentalism. So often these are all seen as somehow separate from one another, you know, that somehow addressing kind of biodiversity or thinking about endangered animals and the destruction of nature is somehow separate from kind of policy making when it comes to, you know, achieving 1.5 and things like that. So it somehow these things, especially within a context like COP, can all somehow become divorced from each other. So when we were thinking about Tarabot and also just our approach to how we think about the climate crisis in general, we wanted to really take a very comprehensive look. And you know, hence the artist's garden, thinking about biodiversity all the way through to thinking about architectural materials. And Solimar's practice, I mean, she's been working, I think, you know, pretty much her entire career, the last 30 years in Dubai, sorry, just excuse me, on this idea of thinking about indigenous trees and thinking about indigenous animals in the UAE, and how as the UAE has become increasingly urbanized, what has happened, and the city is sort of pushed out into the desert and actually into the ocean as well, what has happened to nature through that time. And again, there are a couple of kind of hero species that probably people do associate with the UAE, particularly you think about the various types of gazelles or birds of prey, but there's a huge diversity within the desert. And we actually had the previous artist garden project was titled Desert is a Forest, and it was this idea that the desert is a place of abundance and it's a place of beauty, and it's a regenerative space that is host to many plants and animals, and particularly insect species. And this is kind of sometimes overlooked, right? There's this sort of idea of the empty quarter and the idea of emptiness in the desert, of barrenness. And so it's about sort of putting back that idea that the desert is actually a place that, a place that hosts an enormous diversity of wildlife. And so many of these species that Solimar has been looking at, both trees and animals, have either been impacted by the urbanization or the kind of invasion of species from elsewhere that have kind of taken over. And our idea of what is kind of desirable, again, is something that's slightly sort of inherited, something very green that needs constant watering, sort of plants and animals that come from elsewhere that you think of as being native to the space. So it's kind of, again, about resetting our minds and seeing beauty and abundance in places that are often characterized as being somehow barren. And Solimar's work, well, she's an exceptional artist in terms of her drawing and painting and production, and also very innovative in her approach. So, for example, she quite often uses the leaves of trees such as the gaff tree, the native gaff tree to the UAE, to actually dye the materials that she works with and then paints on top of them. And she has this kind of like layering process. So part of her work is about drawing attention and raising awareness to how we think about nature around us. But the other half is also very experimental in terms of actually using those materials as kind of, as within her practice and within her artworks themselves. So that kind of combination felt very akin to Adib, and a great way to kind of incorporate this, raising of awareness within the structure of the pavilion itself. So Solimar has produced these kinds of panels that are embedded within the pavilion, which I guess we should subscribe, but you will have images as well. So these panels that exist within the pavilion, and each one highlights a range of trees and animals that are native to the UAE, but also endangered at this time and that need special attention. And they're incredibly beautiful. So they're kind of these artworks you're instantly sort of drawn to, and they have a fantastic element of education within them too. So we're already doing school visits and university classes within the pavilion, and this is a great way to sort of discuss the kinds of animals that we know and don't know that are very much part of our everyday.
How has the pavilion become an ecotone, an area where the non-human and human worlds meet?
Yeah, I mean, so this idea of an ecotone, so that comes from my work in sort of ecosystem restoration and biomimicry and all of that. And it's I really like this idea because an ecotone is where two very different ecosystems meet. So think of a river that's going into the sea, and both are kind of very different. You have a freshwater ecosystem and a saltwater ecosystem. You have very different organisms that live in each. But when they meet, they actually create a third kind of space. And that space is ripe for innovation, is ripe for new organisms to appear. So that space usually has a lot more richness of life. And it's sort of bridging between, between these two different ecosystems. And it's also, you have organisms that actually move from one ecosystem to the other. So it's a really interesting space. For me, this is kind of where the magic happens. And with Tarabot, the idea is that this is not necessarily the building of the future, but this is our transitional work that needs to be done on our way to the buildings of the future. And obviously, I mean, we humans are nature, and that's one of the main problems, that we need to remember that we are actually nature. So putting in opposition like human or like man-made ecosystems versus natural ecosystems is a bit of a, it's not a great way to do it, but I mean, that's the easiest way for people to understand. But when we're looking at these sort of very man-made urban environments that are not suitable for life, not like barely even, human life or other life, and then how do we bridge that with the very natural, ecosystems that are around us? But what is that meeting place? So we're not going to restore sand dunes and desert ecosystem in the middle of Dubai. That's not the intention of this project. But what is that rich place where the magic can happen between that kind of very highly urbanized and then highly natural environments? And so the design itself lends itself to that because it is made at different levels. It has different scales. So it caters from the insect life all the way to kind of bird life and to human life. The materials that are used are non-toxic for humans or any other organisms. The life that let's say the fresh water we're producing is actually shared across these different species. The plants, the vegetation that we're planting, so once we have healthy soil and fresh water, that allows us to have actual vegetation. And so the bottom layer that's accessible to humans is planted with vegetables that go back to feed the restaurant. So we're closing the loop in terms of taking the waste from the restaurant, cycling it through the soil, creating compost that goes to plant vegetables that goes back into the restaurant. But also the upper parts of the pavilion are catering only to other organisms. So the insects, which, once they start coming onto the native flowers and native shrubs and trees, then they start attracting the birds. And that's how you build up the complexity of life. And then shade, for example, is something that both, that all kind of species need, especially in these very harsh environments. And that was something that was missing from that site outside of the Jameel Art Center. So providing shade using these local materials such as the arish, which is the palm fronds. Again, that's not to traditional architecture and traditional roofing systems, but doing it in a much more modern way. So those are the different strategies that we've employed. And then, of course, with the second life that this takes on, that is where all of these materials can get decomposed to feed the soil. All of the materials are, invite the community to come and take over the pavilion, to take away the different parts. So we're disseminating those across the different biomes of the UAE so that people can take the plants and the shrubs and the flowers and plant them in their gardens, on their rooftops. And so we are disseminating the native and the local food source for these native species across people's usually highly exotic landscapes. And then this structure itself takes on a second life and so it was designed with its second life in mind, which is we worked with a coral reef restoration organization, and we redesigned or fine-tuned our design in terms of the material, to the way that the material was treated, to the sizing and the spacing of the different components, so that it can become the site of a coral reef restoration project out in Fujairah. So about 2 hours away from the site where it's located right now. So that's like all of these ideas come together. And so we're connecting life on land with life under the sea. And it's really important for us to kind of show people that this has another life that it's taking on, and it's actually going to augment and exponentially increase life. So we could have easily just sort of said, okay, all the steel is going to be recycled. But then, okay, that's doing something very small. But what about actually this becoming a support for a whole ecosystem? So it opens up the imagination and kind of pushes the boundary of what's possible